Hi, welcome back. In September 2017, the city of San Francisco officially unveiled the Comfort Women Column of Strength, a bronze sculpture created by California-based artist Stephen White to honor the women and girls forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese military during World War II. Like many memorials dedicated to this issue throughout the United States, the monument really drew limited public attention among most Americans. But it wasn't a small civic act to have this statue unveiled. It was the culmination of decades of arduous activism and years of educational campaigns that eventually led to the formation of an organization called Comfort Women Justice Coalition, or CWJC. It was their efforts that resulted in a unanimous vote by San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 2015 to install the monument. And the San Francisco mayor at the time, Ed Lee, the first Asian American person to be elected mayor of the city, he firmly defended the memorial's educational mission. 2 years later, under the leadership of retired judges Julie Tang and Lillian Singh, the CWJC made San Francisco the first major U.S. city to host this kind of memorial. San Francisco, it wasn't the first city in the U.S. or even in California to erect a monument to the women and girls enslaved by the Japanese military. In 2013, Glendale became the first city in California to install a monument like this, and they called it the Peace Monument of Glendale. And predictably, many in Japan were really angered by this unveiling. A transnational organization called the Global Alliance for Historical Truth, or GATT, aligned with Japanese revisionist interests and sued the city of Glendale. And the Ninth Circuit Court rejected the challenge in 2016. And a year later, the U.S. Supreme Court, it declined to even hear the case. This was a really significant legal precedent because it cleared the way for San Francisco and other cities, making it clear that these memorials could withstand judicial scrutiny, even under the weight of international diplomatic protests from the Japanese government. Last week, we discussed the ongoing struggles of activists in both the Philippines and Okinawa as they confronted the complex problems created by U.S. military bases in both of those regions. Because of the unique historical circumstances surrounding these bases, their origins, and the deep economic dependencies that they create, activists in both places rely heavily on transnational relationships with other anti-base movements around the world to sustain their campaigns, which at times it seems insurmountable. The unveiling of the Column of Strength in a city like San Francisco, it marks a key victory in this broader landscape of transnational activism that we'll be discussing throughout the final weeks of this semester. Over decades, countless meetings took place among women across Asia, North America, and beyond, as they worked to sustain the momentum necessary to persuade governments both in the United States and elsewhere to materially recognize the suffering of the women and girls enslaved during World War II. While this unveiling momentarily attracted a lot of media attention, most Americans paid little attention to the larger significance of these memorials after hearing about the event initially. Not necessarily the atrocities that the women endured, but what the memorials symbolized between the U.S. and Japan in their relationship. This event in San Francisco, it immediately triggered a diplomatic controversy. Japan's consul general in San Francisco, for example, Jun Yamada, denounced the memorial as a one-sided interpretation of history, while the mayor of Osaka, Hirofumi Yoshimura, threatened to end the long-standing sister city relationship with San Francisco unless the statue was removed. Many people, including journalists and scholars, referred to this broad group of critics, like Gatt, as historical revisionists. But pause for a second. I don't mean historical revisionists in an objective or academic sense. In scholarly terms, historical revisionism, it refers to the reinterpretation of established historical narratives, often by re-examining evidence or introducing new sources. Historians, they do this all the time. In fact, ethnic studies and Asian American studies could be seen as forms of historical revisionism, since both fields emerged to challenge dominant narratives that erased or misrepresented communities of color in the United States. But the work that scholars in my field do, it also walks a really delicate line. And this is because historical revisionism can also be described as a politically motivated effort to distort or deny well-documented historical events in order to serve contemporary ideological or national agendas. And as you can imagine, there are plenty of people in the United States who interpret ethnic studies and the kinds of histories that I teach as politically driven forms of historical revisionism. It's this same kind of debate that's unfolding around the Comfort Women memorials. There's a large and influential group of people made up of corporate executives, politicians, and academics throughout Japan who deny that the Imperial Japanese Army instituted a system of sexual slavery during World War II. Scholars and activists, including those organizations like the CWJC, they call them revisionists because this group, it rejects what the historical record and survivors' testimonies have long established as fact. And because many of these revisionist figures are among the most powerful members of Japanese society, survivors and the activists who support them continue to face enormous barriers to receiving the recognition that many, myself included, believe that they deserve. This controversy, it strikes at the heart of many of the central ideas that we've been exploring in this class. I hope that you see that. The Comfort Women movement, it doesn't just reflect key elements of transnational activism today and the suffering of the women and girls. It doesn't simply provide evidence for you to understand just how destructive imperialism has been throughout recent history. This movement, it also reveals the importance of knowledge making itself, of what it means to know. For this community of, let's call them deniers, this is their ethnic studies. They see themselves as fighting a massive transnational force that, in their view, is fundamentally distorting the honor of an entire nation, Japan. Just look at the name of GATT, the Global Alliance for Historical Truth. What do you think they mean by truth? There were a lot of moments when news outlets alluded to the idea that this dispute, it marked a flashpoint in the ongoing struggle over how Japan's wartime past should be remembered and represented. But unfortunately, most of these news reports represented the monument as a culmination of triumph for the women and girls who suffered years of torture and rape. And for most people, these monuments, it just represents a recognition of that suffering, something that happened in the past, and we don't have to think about it anymore. There were moments that news outlets actually pointed to the importance of this moment for how Japan would be recognized and remembered for its wartime past. But mostly, the monument, for most people, represents a culmination of triumph for these women and girls who suffered years of torture and rape. And for those people, these monuments, they represent a recognition that now we can move on and not have to think about all of those things that happened in the past. Instead, in this week's lecture, we're going to examine how the comfort women issue, how it's become a central battleground in what Japanese commentators call Rikishi Senso, or the history wars. You see, it's important to understand that for Japan, this war isn't simply a dispute about historical fact. It's not just an intellectual disagreement over words or our understanding of what happened in the past. The reason why there's such an intense and powerful opposition to these transnational movements of recognition is because this controversy, it represents a war over Japan's national identity and the collective memory of its citizens. Many of those who endured this sexual violence, women like Jan Ruff O'Hearn, one of the first non-Korean survivors to gain global attention, they dislike this term comfort women. But the thing is, most people throughout the world, they still use this terminology when discussing this issue. If you were to read my script, you'd see that I put the term comfort women in quotation marks. I do that because the term should always be challenged, even as I speak it. However, I continue to use the term because this struggle, it marks a specific moment in the global fight against sexual servitude and human trafficking, which often occurs during wartime. Comfort women, it's a very specific term. It refers to the women and girls who were forced into sexual servitude for Japan's imperial forces, primarily during, but also in the period leading up to World War II. Most came from Korea, China, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Indonesia, though there were victims like Ruff O'Hearn, who also came from the Netherlands East Indies and other Japanese colonial territories throughout Asia. And it's very important to recognize that this system, it was created well before World War II began. You see, during the 1930s and 1940s, Japan's imperial armed forces, it created a vast and brutal network of military brothels known as comfort stations. The women and girls forced into these spaces, they were euphemistically called comfort women, but in reality, they were victims of one of the most organized systems of sexual slavery in modern history. We know this happened through decades of painstaking research by historians, activists, and the survivors themselves. The system, it began in the early 1930s, shortly after Japan's invasion of China, when reports of mass rape by Japanese soldiers during the 1932 Shanghai incident provoked international outrage. The Japanese military responded to this outrage by institutionalizing sexual violence under the guise of regulation. Military authorities, they built brothels wherever troops were stationed, first in China and then across all of the occupied territories throughout Asia and the Pacific. Government documents uncovered by historians like Yoshiaka Yoshimi, they show that the army not only approved the creation of comfort stations, but they managed them directly. The orders describe the system as a way to maintain discipline and prevent venereal diseases, masking what was, in essence, a state-administrated network of sexual enslavement. Other scholars, like Yuki Tanaka, Osi Saraso, they estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 women were enslaved in this system. Though the exact number, obviously, it will never ever be known because there were so many records that were destroyed at the end of the war. Most of these women came from Japan's colonies and occupied territories, those places like Korea, Taiwan, and China, and the Philippines that we talked about already. Some of these women were deceived by false job offers. Others were abducted or coerced by military recruiters. In many cases, local brokers or civilian contractors worked under the direct supervision of the Japanese army, disguising the process as voluntary employment. Once recruited, women were transported by ship or train to military camps, where they were forced to have sex with soldiers literally day after day under brutal conditions. That's why so many of them passed away. Survivor testimonies describe beatings, forced abortions, sexually transmitted infections, and of course, profound psychological trauma. Even in the rare cases where women might have signed contracts or received nominal payment, historians like So, they emphasize that the absence of consent and the impossibility of leaving made these arrangements coercive in every sense. But a lot of deniers, they claim that these women were simply wartime prostitutes who entered into contracts willingly, as if that makes their torture or the massive numbers of deaths acceptable. That's unreal. But the archival records, they tell us a very different story. In 1938, Japan's Home Ministry, it issued a memorandum warning recruiters not to kidnap or buy women, an acknowledgement that these abuses, they were happening. And decades later, in 1992, Yoshimi discovered direct military correspondence ordering army units to supervise recruitment. Clear evidence of state and military complicity. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the surviving comfort women, they were largely abandoned. Many returned home burdened by stigma and shame from their families and communities. During the post-war U.S. occupation, this issue, it disappeared from public discussion. American authorities, preoccupied with stabilizing Japan as a Cold War ally, they had little incentive to pursue justice for these crimes. Right now, it's so important to recognize that, ironically, the U.S. military itself established its own system of sexual labor during the occupation, just like they did in Korea. The Recreation and Amusement Association, created by U.S. occupying forces, was designed to manage soldiers' sexual behavior. And this, as historian Yuki Tanaka points out, also contributed to the Allied powers and their reluctance to treat Japan's comfort women's system as a war crime during the Tokyo trials. Over the following decades, historians both in Japan and all over the world, such as Yoshimi and Tanaka, uncovered extensive documentary evidence showing that the Japanese military, it directly established, regulated, and managed these brothels. And their work, the work of these historians, it was later supported by outside investigations from human rights experts, people like Radhika Kulashrami, who oversaw an entire United Nations inquiry into these cases of mass sexual violence and trafficking. And in her report, she described this as both a system and one of military sexual slavery under international law. Those specific words, system of military sexual slavery, they're profoundly important. In the same way that the words nation, human, and rights, all of these words carry powerful legal and moral authority. They define who, and they do this because they define who's deserving and what they deserve. And outside of those legal boundaries lies the inverse, those who are not recognized and therefore what they do not deserve. The phrase system of military sexual slavery, it asserts that the Imperial Japanese government was directly responsible for the atrocities that occurred within the comfort women's system. But of course, there are many other scholars, especially conservative and nationalist writers, who disagree. I talked about one of them a couple of lectures ago. They claim that the system, it involved licensed prostitution, not state coercion. They argue that it was civilian contractors, not the military, who recruited most of these women. But as I already said, these views they conflict with official military documents that attest to the imperial military's direct coordination of recruitment, transport, and confinement of these women and girls. More than 2 decades before the unveiling of the Comfort Women Column of Strength, the Comfort Women issue, it gained global traction for the very first time back in 1991, when Kim Hak-sun, a Korean survivor, broke decades of silence and finally testified about her experiences to the rest of the world. It was her courage that inspired so many others, including Ruth O'Hearn and other survivors across Asia, to come forward. This surge of testimony prompted Japan's government to investigate, which led to that seminal Kono Statement in August 4th, 1993. In that statement, Chief Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei admitted that many women were recruited against their will and that the military was directly or indirectly involved, and that the experience severely injured the honor and dignity of many women. This remains Japan's official position today. However, there are a lot of right-wing politicians and commentators who have challenged the Kono Statement ever since. They argue that the statement was politically motivated and based on insufficient evidence. They also claim that its tone was overly apologetic. Some of them have called for its retraction. Most historians, though, point out that the statement reflects an accurate reading of the available evidence and survivor testimony. As Hirofumi Hayashi notes, the Kono Statement, it remains a crucial document in Japan's reckoning with wartime responsibility, even if its language of remorse stops short of a formal legal apology. Hayashi writes that the Japanese government generally upholds the 1993 acknowledgement by Chief Cabinet Secretary Kono Yohei of state and military culpability, but forcefully disavows a key admission: the coercive mobilization of women and their sexual enslavement by the imperial military forces. By the mid-1990s, references to comfort women were included in all of Japanese junior high school history textbooks. And as you can imagine, this inclusion provoked fierce backlash among denialists and conservatives who argued that Japan's education system had become masochistic, a term frequently used by nationalist critics to describe history that focuses on Japan's wartime aggression rather than its achievements. So many parallels with what's happening in the United States over the last 2 decades. There are so many parallels with what's been happening across the United States over the last couple of decades. In response, conservative intellectuals founded the Society for History Textbook Reform. In 1996, this group sought to restore national pride by revising or removing accounts of wartime atrocities, including the famous Nanjing Massacre, but also the comfort women system. Scholars such as Yoshiki Nozaki describes this as part of a broader movement of post-war historical revisionism aimed at reshaping Japan's collective memory. Around the same period, a new generation of conservative politicians began to rise, and among them was Abe Shinzo, who would later become Japan's longest-serving prime minister. Abe's political philosophy, known as Abe Shugi, or Abeism, emphasized a strong state, a more assertive military, and a rejection of what he called Japan's masochistic view of history. Yeah, why should our kids and our students constantly be forced to learn about the bad things that happened in the past? Abe argued that Japan should be proud of its past instead, and that Abe argued that Japan, it should be proud of its past instead, and that it was the post-war constraints, especially the US drafted Article 9 of the Constitution, which renounces war in Japan. It's what's limiting Japan's sovereignty and independence. During his first term in 2007, Abe publicly denied evidence that women had been forcibly recruited by the military, claiming that there was no proof of coercion in the narrow sense. His remarks drew outrage in Asia and the United States, and it's what led Congress here in America to pass House Resolution 121, which urged Japan to issue a clear and unequivocal apology and to educate future generations about the comfort women system. This is what led to Abe later softening his rhetoric, stating that he upheld the 1993 Kono Statement, though his administration consistently sought to reinterpret or dilute its meaning. When Abe returned to power in 2012, however, historical revisionism among denialist movements accelerated, backed by the Liberal Democratic Party and powerful groups such as Nippon Kaigi. Japan's largest conservative organization, denialists reframed the comfort women issue as an anti-Japan campaign orchestrated by China and South Korea. Nippon Kaigi's platform explicitly connected historical denialism to broader political goals, rewriting textbooks, revising Article 9, and restoring the emperor's symbolic authority, amounting to a partial revival of pre-war ideological frameworks. After everything that you've learned in class this semester, do you see how dangerous this is? But as you've also learned in this class, history is very complicated, including that there's no clear-cut explanation for Abe's motivations or political ideology. A number of scholars disagree with the view that Abe was purely a revisionist denier. Political scientist Christopher Hughes, for instance, argues that Abe's policies reflected pragmatic concerns about national security rather than outright denial of war crimes. Yet even these scholars acknowledge that Abe's rhetoric often downplayed Japan's wartime responsibility, and it actually emboldened right-wing movements back at home. Right-wing activism became increasingly visible in the 2010s. Groups such as Satai Kukai, or Citizens Against Special Privileges for Koreans in Japan, an action conservative movement, began staging public demonstrations. They used hate speech, denied war crimes, and spread their message online through nationalist media like Channel Sakura. Unlike older conservative associations, these new groups appealed to younger generations through their live stream protests and online forums. The scholar Jeffrey Hall calls this discursive formation reproduced by this counter-movement as patriotic resistance. Patriotic resistance blends xenophobia, misogyny, and online populism into a unified political agenda. This is what Hall writes. In framing their actions as patriotic resistance against anti-Japanese media and foreign pressure, online activists, protest organizers redefine historical denialism as an act of national defense, blending xenophobia, misogyny, and populist anger into a new form of digital nationalism. What he means by this is that this moment has become really unique because for these groups to be proud of Japan and proud of being Japanese is intimately intertwined with patriarchy, sexism, and xenophobia. And it's also important to note that women play a highly visible role in these counter-movements. Groups like Nadeshiko Action, founded by Yamamoto Yumiko, former Secretary General and Vice President of the extremist anti-Korean organization Zaito Kukai, intentionally uses female voices to lend moral authority to their revisionist narratives. Yamamoto has argued that since the comfort women issue concerns women, it should be addressed by women. But her organization denies that the issue was about women's human rights. Instead, it portrayed the controversy as a Korea-led anti-Japan campaign. In English, Nadeshiko Action calls itself Japanese Women for Justice and Peace, a name that deliberately mirrors liberal human rights language to mask its revisionist message. Something really important to the movement happened in 2014, however. Japan's liberal magazine, Asahi Shimbun, retracted several articles that relied on a now discredited source, Yoshida Seiji, whose fabricated testimony described mass kidnappings of women in Korea. And although these stories represented only a small fraction of Asahi's extensive reporting on the comfort women issue, right-wing media and nationalist politicians jumped on the moment. And this powerful group of deniers, they forced the magazine to retract all of their investigations and make the claim that the entire history of the comfort women system was all a fabrication. You see, this is a classic political tactic, using a few discredited cases to undermine the overwhelming body of documentary and testimonial evidence confirming that the Japanese military was directly involved in sexual slavery. These isolated fabrications, they don't invalidate the historical reality of Japan's system of military sexual enslavement. Nonetheless, the Asahi controversy reignited and emboldened nationalist outrage and triggered a wave of lawsuits, protests, and harassment campaigns targeting journalists, academics, and activists who continued to address Japan's wartime responsibility. Seriously, there were some scholars who were actually put in jail for their claims and their research. By this point, the battlefield of the comfort women debate, it expanded beyond Japan. In the United States, the unveiling of memorials such as the Statue of Peace in Glendale sparked transnational disputes. Japanese right-wing organizers supported by Sankai Shimbo and Nippon Kaiji filed lawsuits against American cities, arguing that these statues defamed all of Japan. The lawsuits, including Global Alliance for Historical Truth versus City of Glendale, which I mentioned earlier in this lecture, they were all rejected by U.S. courts and ultimately dismissed by the Supreme Court in 2017. Yet despite these legal defeats, the revisionist movement continued to target American school curricula and university scholars, claiming that the anti-Japan bias had taken hold in the West. Seriously, a lot of my colleagues across the country, including one of my colleagues in my department, has had to endure a lot of harassment by the Japanese government because of their work in this issue. While mainstream historians view those campaigns as attempts to suppress discussion of wartime sexual violence, revisionists describe them as efforts to defend Japan's honor abroad. This tension, it reveals how questions of history are inseparable from Japan's ongoing struggle over identity and diplomacy. In December 2015, Japan and South Korea reached a surprise diplomatic agreement, declaring that the comfort women issue was finally and irreversibly resolved. Under the terms of the deal, Japan acknowledged military involvement in the establishment of the comfort stations and pledged 1 billion yen to a South Korean foundation to support surviving victims, on the condition that both governments would refrain from raising the issue in international forums. Many survivors and advocacy groups condemned the agreement for excluding their voices and failing to ensure accountability. This is a very important point to note. This agreement, like so many other transnational issues that you'll be exploring throughout the rest of this semester and in your final projects, They reveal how so many global conflicts are often settled through a logic of reconciliation that prioritizes political convenience over genuine historical justice. And that's what leads to what Grace Cho describes as ghosts haunting generations of women in places like Korea. These intergenerational cycles of Han, the unresolved grief and resentment throughout all of these places throughout Asia, they remain unhealed precisely because of the institutionalization of political compromises that repeatedly silence the experiences of those who suffered the most. You might be surprised to learn that even within Japan's right wing, the 2015 agreement caused deep divisions. Mainstream conservatives close to the Abe administration viewed it as a pragmatic act of diplomacy, while hardline groups such as Nippon Kaigi and Zaitoku Kai and the new religious movement Happy Science denounced it as an outright betrayal. I bring this up because this backlash once again demonstrates the complexities of these histories, that movements for historical revision aren't monolithic. Some nationalist conservatives are willing to accept limited diplomatic compromise, while others are uncompromising denialists who reject any admission of wrongdoing altogether. Since 2016, Japan's historical revisionist activists have increasingly targeted international institutions, including the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, accusing them of being dominated by leftist NGOs. These counter-activists have sent delegations to Geneva to lobby against UN resolutions and reports that describe the comfort women system as a form of sexual slavery. However, UN bodies drawing on decades of historical research and international legal findings, they continue to affirm that this system, it does in fact meet the legal criteria for slavery and constitutes, therefore, a crime against humanity. Ultimately, debates over the comfort women's issue, it reflects a lot of the broader tensions in Japan's post-war national identity. That's why they call this debate history wars. They're not simply about historical evidence, but about what kind of nation Japan believes itself to be. For survivors, the comfort women issue, it represents a demand for justice and recognition. But for revisionists, it's framed as a struggle to defend Japan's national honor. Yet within both movements, there are internal divisions, different ideologies, priorities, and strategies that often conflict with one another. And these divisions, they can become moments of opportunity for opposing groups to exploit or strengthen their own positions. Next week, we'll shift focus to an entirely different transnational movement, the indigenous environmental movement in Taiwan. Like the comfort women issue, these global movements are complex and multifaceted. It's vital that when you think about any of these issues that we talk about in class, that none of these issues contain two clear sides only. All right, see you then.